Some family secrets refuse to stay buried. They fester in the dark, crying out for justice until they find a voice. Tonight, we enter a nightmare where a noble knight is chosen by a ghost to uncover a betrayal centuries in the making. There is a weariness that goes beyond the body, a fatigue that settles deep in the soul. Sir Philip Harclay knew it well. For years, the clang of steel on steel had been his music, the grim fields of the Crusades his home. He had seen men's lives extinguished in a flash of sunlight on a sword's edge, had felt the arid desert winds scour his face, and had stood on battlements watching empires burn. Now, returning to an England he barely recognized, a profound exhaustion clung to him like a shroud. It was in the ache of his bones, the dull throb behind his eyes, and in the heavy, quiet sorrow that had taken root in his heart. His journey homeward had been long, the roads a ribbon of mud and stone unwinding through an unfamiliar countryside. As the sun began to bleed its final orange and purple light across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the trees, he knew he could go no further. Ahead, nestled in a small, sleepy hollow, stood a modest inn, a plume of gray smoke curling from its chimney like a welcoming finger. It was a humble place, but it promised a roof, a fire, and a reprieve from the saddle. For a man as tired as Sir Philip, it was a palace. The room he was given was small and simple, with rough-hewn wooden walls and a single, narrow bed. A lone candle sputtered on a small table, its flame dancing in the drafts that snaked through the old building. After a meager meal, Sir Philip fell onto the cot, not even bothering to remove all of his traveling clothes. He was a man accustomed to sleeping on hard ground, his armor his only pillow. The thin mattress felt like a cloud. He did not drift into sleep. He plunged into it, a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. There were no thoughts, no gentle transitions, only a sudden and total surrender to the darkness of unconsciousness. And it was in that profound, unguarded darkness that the dream took him. He was not in the small, cramped room of the inn anymore. The scent of wood smoke and ale was gone, replaced by a smell of damp earth, wet stone, and something else, something ancient and sorrowful, like the smell of forgotten memories. He was standing on open ground, and the very air was wrong. It was cold, unnaturally still, and thick with a ghostly white mist that coiled around his ankles like phantom serpents. Before him, rising out of the mist, was a castle. He knew it instantly, though he had never seen it look this way. Lovell Castle, a bastion of power and nobility, a place he remembered from his youth as being proud and strong, its banners snapping defiantly in the wind. But this was not that castle. This was a specter, a memory of a castle dredged up from a nightmare. Its great stone towers were black against a bruised, starless sky. The stones themselves seemed to weep a dark, slick moisture, and the arrow slits in the walls were like vacant, staring eye sockets. The entire structure seemed to sag under the weight of an unseen grief. The mist that swirled at its base was a living thing. It did not drift with the breeze, for there was no breeze to feel. It clung to the ground, thick and opaque, hiding the foundations of the castle, making it seem as if the entire fortress were floating in a sea of white nothingness. The silence it created was absolute. It muffled the world, swallowing all sound, until Sir Philip felt as if he were wrapped in cotton wool, isolated and utterly alone. Then, a sound did come, and it was not from the world outside. It was a whisper that seemed to be born from the wind itself, though no wind blew. It was a low, mournful sigh that snaked through the battlements above, a sound that was impossibly, horribly human. It was the sound of a lament, a long, drawn-out expression of a sorrow so deep it had stained the very air. Sir Philip, a man who had faced down charging armies without flinching, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This was a fear his sword could not answer, a chill his knightly courage could not warm. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a lone, living statue in a dead landscape. He was a prisoner of the dream, unable to move, unable to look away from the terrible majesty of the phantom castle. He was a witness, but to what, he did not yet know. He only knew that this place was waiting for something. The air was taut with anticipation, like the moment before a lightning strike. And then it began. From the highest tower, a sound shattered the sepulchral silence. A single, resonant toll of a great bell. Yong! It was not the cheerful, clear chime of a village church. This sound was deep, mournful, and impossibly heavy. It was a sound coated in rust and grief. It did not ring out. It seemed to fall from the sky, hitting the ground and spreading through the mist in slow, ponderous waves. Sir Philip felt the vibration not in his ears, but in his chest, a deep, shuddering pulse that seemed to momentarily stop his heart. A pause, an agonizing, silent stretch of time. Then again. Yong! The second toll was deeper, sadder, more final than the first. With it, the mournful wind seemed to pick up, the whispers growing more distinct, almost forming words of warning that he couldn't quite decipher. He was counting now instinctively. That was 2. Dong. 3. The mist around his feet thickened, growing colder, reaching up to his knees. Dong. 4. He noticed that the slick moisture on the castle walls was now running down like black tears. With each toll of the midnight bell, the dream world became more solid, more real, more inescapable. It was a ritual, a ceremony. A countdown to a revelation he was beginning to desperately wish he could avoid. He tried to close his eyes, to force himself awake, to flee back to the safety of the little inn, but his body would not obey. He was an audience of one, bound to his seat for the end of the play. 7, 8, 9. The tolls came faster now, more insistent, a frantic, hammering heartbeat of a dying giant. The air grew heavy, pressing in on him, making it hard to draw a breath. 10. The whispers in the wind were clearer now, a single word, repeated over and over. Betrayal, betrayal, betrayal. 11. The penultimate toll, a sound of pure despair. And as it faded, an almost unbearable silence fell once more. The world held its breath, waiting for the final stroke. Yong! The 12th and final toll was not a sound, but a cataclysm. It was a sonic blow that shook the very foundations of the dream. And as its last vibration died away into the sorrowful wind, something new happened. From the great, black oak doors of the castle came a low, protesting groan. The sound of ancient, rusted hinges being forced to move after centuries of stillness. Slowly, impossibly, the massive doors began to swing inward. They opened not with a push from a human hand, but as if pulled by an invisible, inexorable force. They opened onto a chasm of perfect, impenetrable darkness. It was not an absence of light. It was a presence, a solid wall of black that promised horrors within. The opening was a silent invitation, a dark mouth ready to swallow him whole. And Sir Philip knew, with a certainty that was colder than any mist, that he was meant to enter. An invisible force pulled Sir Philip Harclay across the threshold, from the swirling mists of the dream world into the chilling stillness of the castle's heart. The moment he stepped inside, the heavy oak doors swung shut behind him with a deep, booming sound that echoed through the cavernous space like a coffin lid being hammered down. The faint, whispering wind was gone. The roar of the phantom sea was gone. Here, inside, was a silence of a different kind of dead, breathless silence that was far more terrifying than any storm. He was entombed. He stood in the great hall of Lovell Castle, but it was a caricature of the noble space he remembered from his youth. The scale of it was overwhelming. The vaulted ceiling soared so high into the gloom that it was lost to sight, as if the room had no roof but the starless night sky of the dream itself. The air was frigid, carrying the deep, cellar-damp chill of a place that had not known the warmth of a fire or a human touch for centuries. It was the cold of the grave, a cold that seeped past his clothes and into his very marrow. Along the walls hung immense, tattered tapestries. In the faint, inexplicable light that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, he could make out their designs. They depicted scenes of a vibrant, happy life. A noble family feasting, knights riding out for a hunt, children playing in a sunlit courtyard. But time and a profound neglect had ravaged them. Great swaths of thread had rotted away, leaving gaping black holes in the images. The smiling faces were distorted by mildew and damp, their woven eyes now appearing to weep dark, ugly stains down the length of the fabric. The scenes of joy had become monuments to decay, a grim testament to a golden age long since turned to dust. Sir Philip, a man whose courage was legend, felt the first true tendrils of primal fear coil in his gut. This was not the fear of battle, of a known enemy with a sword in his hand. This was a deep existential dread, the fear of a place where the laws of nature had been suspended, where sorrow had become a physical presence, and where time itself had died. He scanned the vast, empty hall, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of a sword that wasn't there. The feeling of being watched was immense, a palpable pressure on the back of his neck. He was not alone. And then he saw it. In the farthest, darkest corner of the hall, where the shadows were thickest and most absolute, a patch of darkness seemed to deepen. It detached itself from the surrounding gloom, a vertical shadow where no shadow should be. It was not a sudden appearance. It was a slow, agonizing coalescing, as if the very atoms of the night were reluctantly weaving themselves together into a form. At first, it was just a pillar of blackness. Then, it began to take on a shape, a tall, man-like silhouette. It was utterly silent. There was no spectral moan, no clanking of chains. There was only this silent, horrifying birth from the darkness. As the figure became more defined, Sir Philip could see that it was draped, swathed from head to toe in some kind of cloth. It was not the clean, white linen of a holy shroud. This fabric was the color of old, yellowed bone, stained with dark patches of what looked like grave mold and the unmistakable brown of dried, ancient blood. The cloth hung in heavy, stiff folds, as if it had been damp for 100 years, and it clung to the limbs beneath, outlining a tall, once powerful frame now rigid with death. This was not a spirit, an ethereal wisp of smoke. This thing was terrifyingly, impossibly solid. It had weight. It had presence. It had come directly from the cold, suffocating earth. Sir Philip's breath hitched in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the dead silence. Every instinct screamed at him to turn, to run, to beat his fists against the sealed door until his knuckles were raw. But his feet were leaden, rooted to the cold stone floor. He could only watch as the shrouded figure took a slow, deliberate step out of the corner and into the faint gray light. Its movements were stiff, unnatural, the motion of a body long and used to walking. It did not glide or float. It walked, each step a dreadful silent pronouncement of its arrival. With each step, a faint, dry, rustling sound reached him, the sound of the ancient, decaying burial cloth whispering against itself. It stopped in the center of the great hall, a lone, terrifying sentinel in the vast emptiness. It stood there for a long moment, motionless. Then, with an agonizing slowness, the head of the figure began to turn towards him. Sir Philip braced himself, expecting to see a skull or a face ravaged by decay. But the reality was far worse. The shroud was wrapped tightly around the head, but a section had fallen away or been torn, leaving a dark gap where the face should be. And from within that dark void, two eyes stared out at him. They were not the empty sockets of a skeleton. They were living eyes, and they blazed with a cold, spectral light. They were eyes that held the accumulated agony of 100 years. Sir Philip saw in them a grief so profound it was like an ocean, a sorrow so deep it had drowned all other emotion. But beneath the grief, simmering like a banked fire, was something else. It was a look of piercing, soul-shattering betrayal. This was not the face of a man who had died peacefully. This was the face of a man who had been wronged, cheated, and cast aside. A man whose legacy had been stolen and whose honor had been trampled into the mud. The pain in that gaze was a physical force, and it struck Sir Philip with the power of a battering ram. In that instant, a shock of recognition, cold and sharp as ice, pierced through his fear. He had seen portraits of the castle's founder, the great Lord Lovell, a man of legendary virtue who had supposedly died honorably in a foreign war. He knew those eyes, the shape, the intensity, the proud set of them. This was not just any phantom. This was him. This was the spirit of Lord Lovell himself, the true and rightful master of this decaying castle. The stories were a lie. He had not died in some far-off land. He had died here, and he had not died in peace. A wave of cold pity washed over Sir Philip, momentarily eclipsing his terror. To be a knight was to uphold justice, to defend the wronged. And before him stood the ultimate victim, a noble soul whose suffering was so great it had chained him to this world, forcing him to walk the halls of his own ruined home for eternity. The ghost of Lord Lovell did not speak. It did not need to. Its eyes, burning with a silent, desperate plea, said everything. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Then the phantom moved again. It raised its right arm, an action that seemed to require immense effort. The stained shroud fell away from its hand, revealing long, pale fingers, the skin translucent over the bone. It was a hand that had once held a sword, signed decrees, and caressed a wife's cheek. Now it was an instrument of spectral communication. The finger, bone-white and trembling slightly, pointed not at Sir Philip, but past him, towards the grand, sweeping staircase that led to the upper floors. Then, it curled inward in a slow, unmistakable beckoning gesture. "Follow me." The command was unspoken, yet it was as clear and absolute as if it had been shouted from the rooftops. It was not a request. It was an order from a master to a vassal, a plea from a tormented soul to a potential savior. Sir Philip felt his own will dissolving, subsumed by the phantom's desperate need. He had been chosen for a reason. His presence in this dream was no accident. He was being recruited into a war that had been raging in the spirit world for a century. With leaden feet, he began to walk, following the shrouded figure as it turned and glided towards the staircase. Its movement was now smoother, a silent drift across the flagstones, while Sir Philip's own footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. They ascended the grand staircase, its marble steps cracked and covered in a fine layer of gray dust that rose in little puffs around their feet. The ghost did not lead him towards the master suites or the solar, the places where the family would have lived and laughed. Instead, it turned away from the grand, public spaces. It led him down a long, narrow corridor he had never seen before. Here, the decay was even more pronounced. The plaster was peeling from the walls in long, leprous strips, revealing the damp, dark stone beneath. The air grew colder still, and the smell of rot and mold was thick and cloying. They were moving from the heart of the castle into its forgotten arteries. This wing was clearly disused, abandoned. Doors hung crookedly on single hinges, opening onto rooms filled with furniture that was draped not in dust cloths, but in thick, web-like shrouds of cobwebs. They passed portraits on the wall, but these were not of the happy, feasting family. These were stern, severe-looking ancestors, and their painted eyes seemed to follow him with a cold, dead malevolence. The ghost of Lord Lovell glided past them without a glance, its purpose fixed, its pace unchanging. It was leading him deeper and deeper into the castle's secret history, into a place of neglect and forgotten things. Each step was a step further into the past, further away from the world of the living. Sir Philip felt as if he were walking through the physical manifestation of a repressed memory, a part of the castle's consciousness that it had tried, and failed, to wall up and forget. The corridor grew darker, narrower, until the only light was the faint, cold luminescence that seemed to cling to the ghost's shroud. He was following a dead man into the darkest corner of his own tomb, and he knew, with a dreadful, rising certainty, that he was about to be shown the crime. The ghost of Lord Lovell did not stop at the end of the long, decaying corridor. At its terminus was a small, unassuming door, one Sir Philip had never noticed in his youth. It was made of thick, dark wood, bound with straps of iron that had rusted into a deep, bloody red. It was a postern gate, a secret exit for servants or for a lord wishing to slip out unnoticed. There was no grand handle, only a simple iron ring. The ghost did not touch it. It simply paused before the door, and with a low, groaning complaint of ancient wood and metal, the heavy bolt on the other side slid back on its own accord. The door swung inward, opening not into the gentle English night, but into a pocket of profound darkness and a silence that was somehow even more absolute than the one within the castle walls. Sir Philip followed the apparition through the doorway, stepping out onto what must have once been a private garden. But the word garden was a grotesque understatement for the scene of rotting splendor that lay before him. This was not a place of neglect. It was a place of desecration. The air here was different still, heavy, and holding a damp, earthy smell like a freshly opened grave. The thick mist from the dream world pooled here, coiling around the bases of crumbling statues and choking the life out of everything it touched. This had been a place of beauty, he could tell, a graveyard of joy. He could see the faint outlines of pathways, now completely overgrown with gnarled, thorny vines that snaked across the ground like thick, black veins. Stone benches, their surfaces coated in a slick green moss, slumped into the earth as if exhausted by their long, lonely vigil. He saw the remains of a fountain, its central statue of a nymph now headless, one arm broken off and lying in the stagnant, black water of the basin. Stone angels with broken wings and sorrowful, eroded faces knelt in prayer amongst weeds that grew as high as a man's waist. It was a place where beauty had been murdered, and its corpse had been left to rot for a century. The ghost glided through this wasteland with a new and terrible purpose. Its slow, mournful pace had quickened, its form cutting a straight, unwavering path through the tangled undergrowth. The thorns and weeds that snagged at Sir Philip's clothes seemed to part before the phantom, bending away from its shrouded form as if in fear. He followed, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He was a knight, a man who understood honor and lineage. He knew what a family's resting place should look like. A proud chapel, a grand crypt, with banners and carved effigies celebrating a noble life. This was the opposite. This was a place of shame, a blemish, a secret deliberately hidden from the world. The ghost was leading him away from the main grounds, towards a far corner of the garden, where a great, ancient yew tree cast a shadow so dark it seemed to be a physical stain on the night. The yew was a tree of graveyards, of death and eternity, and its presence here felt like a grim omen. As they drew closer, Sir Philip saw what the tree was guarding. There, half sunk in the damp earth and almost completely swallowed by a thick blanket of dark, clinging ivy, was a tomb. It was not a grand mausoleum. It was a single, humble sarcophagus of plain, gray stone, its lid a heavy, unadorned slab. It had no name, no date, no inscription of any kind. It was anonymous, forgotten. Its stone shoulders seemed to slump in the earth as if in defeat, its edges softened by a century of rain and sorrow. It was a stone scar on the face of the earth, a monument to something that was meant to be erased from memory. The ghost of Lord Lovell came to a stop directly before it. The air grew impossibly cold. The faint, gray light of the dream seemed to dim, converging on the two figures by the forgotten grave. All the sorrow that had radiated from the phantom, all the profound grief that had filled its eyes, now began to change. The grief did not vanish, but it was sharpened, honed into a new, terrifying emotion. It was the cold, focused intensity of an accusation. Slowly, with a dreadful, deliberate majesty, the phantom turned to face Sir Philip. Its shrouded head lifted, and the blazing eyes within the dark cowl fixed upon him. They were no longer just pleading. They were commanding. They were demanding that he bear witness. Then, the phantom raised its shrouded arm once more. The movement was no longer weak or tentative. It was a gesture of immense power, of a will that had transcended death itself. The stained cloth fell away from the arm, revealing it to the elbow. The skin was pale, waxy, and disturbingly preserved, but it was the hand that held Sir Philip's gaze. It was a nobleman's hand, long-fingered and strong, but now it was animated by a singular, terrible purpose. The hand formed a point. The bone-white forefinger, trembling not with weakness but with a century of suppressed rage, was aimed directly at the center of the moss-covered tomb. The gesture hung in the dead air, more powerful than any shout, more damning than any written confession. It was a silent, screaming accusation that echoed in the deepest parts of Sir Philip's soul. Here the finger seemed to say, "Look, here is the crime. Here is the betrayal. Here is the lie upon which the modern house of Lovell is built." And in that instant, the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Sir Philip's mind. The official story, the one known to all of England, was that Lord Lovell had died and been buried with honors in the Holy Land. His family crypt, in the main chapel of the castle, contained a grand effigy to his memory. But it was a lie, a hollow monument over an empty grave. The true Lord Lovell, the noble crusader, the master of the castle, had not been laid to rest in glory. He had been buried here, in this unmarked, unconsecrated ground, hidden away like a common criminal, his name erased from his own tombstone. The horror of it was a physical blow. This was a crime not just against a man, but against God, against lineage, against the sacred trust of family. To deny a noble knight a proper burial, to hide his body and usurp his legacy, it was the blackest of sins. The sorrow in the phantom's eyes was now perfectly clear. It was the sorrow of a man not just murdered, but utterly erased. The pointing finger remained fixed, a rigid spear of accusation. The ghost held the pose, its blazing eyes never leaving Sir Philip's, burning the scene into his mind, branding it onto his soul. He could see every detail. The dark, weeping yew tree, the tangled thorns, the pathetic, half-sunken tomb, and the ghostly, trembling finger pointing, always pointing. This was the image he was meant to carry back into the waking world. This was his evidence. This was his quest. Then, as the accusation reached its crescendo, the phantom's form began to waver. The edges of its shroud started to blur, losing their solidity. It was as if the dream could no longer sustain such a powerful manifestation of grief and rage. The figure began to unravel, dissolving into wisps of gray smoke that were drawn back into the thick mist surrounding them. The solid limbs became transparent. The burning eyes faded into two faint, sorrowful lights. The last thing to dissolve was the hand, the pointing finger holding its accusatory pose until the very last second before it, too, vanished into the ether. The scene shattered. Sir Philip awoke with a violent gasp, lurching upright in the narrow bed of the inn. The rough wool of the blanket was coarse against his skin. His body was drenched in a cold, clammy sweat, and his heart was pounding in his chest like a war drum. For a dizzying moment he didn't know where he was. The smell of damp earth and grave mold was still thick in his nostrils. The profound, deathly cold of the dream clung to his bones. He looked wildly around the small, dark room. The candle on the table had burned down to a sputtering nub, its flame casting long, dancing shadows on the rough walls. Through the single, grimy window, a pale sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness. It was all real. The humble inn, the hard bed, the chill of the mundane English night. But it was not real enough to erase what he had seen. He closed his eyes, and the image was there, seared onto the inside of his eyelids as if by a branding iron. The forgotten tomb, the sorrowful eyes, and the bone-white finger of the ghost, pointing to the heart of a terrible century-old crime. He knew then, with a certainty that was as absolute as his own name, that it had not been just a dream. It had been a summons, a message delivered across the veil of death. The spirit of a wronged man had reached out to him, a knight of honor, and had laid a sacred and terrible duty at his feet. The weariness of his travels was gone, burned away by the cold fire of a new purpose. He was no longer just a soldier returning home. He was an instrument of justice, chosen by a ghost to uncover a truth that a powerful family had killed to keep buried. And he knew, as he sat there trembling in the dark, that his journey was far from over. It had only just begun. Sir Philip is left with a cold sweat and a haunting image. The dream was no mere fantasy. It was a message from beyond the grave. A noble ghost, a forgotten tomb, and a legacy built on a terrible lie. But what exactly does the spirit of Lord Lovell want from him? And what dark truth is buried in that lonely grave? Let us know your theories below.